Well, thank you everyone for joining us and taking some time out of your week to learn a little bit more about security for Coalition's first Security Week. We're really excited to be diving through the presentations this week, diving through a number of different cybersecurity topics. And for those of you joining us, whether you're one of our broker partners, one of our insurance customers, or interested in learning more about us, this is a very interesting and dynamic time in the cybersecurity industry. It feels like day doesn't go by where you're not seeing another headline about ransomware or about another sort of major attack that's taking place. And so we're excited to dive in and explore some of the major things that we're seeing in the marketplace in participation with some of our partners. And today, we're really excited to be joined by SentinelOne. It's for the topic of ransomware remediation. Now, ransomware is something that we've had a lot of firsthand experience with from our policyholders and from sort of navigating the claims process. And on the SentinelOne side, from endpoint detection and response, or EDR, which is the solution that they offer through their platform. And we're really going to talk about what you as an organization need to know to help make yourself secure from ransomware. Thankfully, there's a lot of things that you can do to help prevent yourself from being the victim of a ransomware attack, or if it does happen, at least know how to respond so that you can have a speedy recovery. So excited to dive into that topic in more detail today. My name is Jen. I'm going to be moderating the conversation today, and I'm excited to be joined by Jared Phipps, who is the SVP of Worldwide Solutions Engineering at SentinelOne, and Leanne Nicolo, who's the IR lead at Coalition. And in their roles, they again have a lot of firsthand direct experience with ransomware, and excited to learn from their expertise today. So before we kick off, Jared, then Leanne, would love to have you introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about your roles at SentinelOne and Coalition.
No, thanks for having me here. I run the sales engineering team to SentinelOne, but we've also done, I think just through the nature of doing POCs and working with prospective clients, we find a lot of bad stuff. And so for the last 10 years or so in these types of roles, I've always had some pretty good relationships and pretty good involvement with incident response engagements. I've gone on a lot of engagements and worked on a lot of engagements myself directly. And before all this, I started off in the Air Force, where I worked in cybersecurity and did some IR work there as well. So it's definitely IR in general as a topic, but ransomware is sort of this I would say pandemic now that I've watched from the ground up as it created, and I feel like I've had a front row seat to a disaster, and so it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. It's beyond companies and vendors. It's really like at this point I just want to win. I want to beat these guys down. So yeah, I'm very passionate about ransomware.
Thank you. And Leanne.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. Good morning, everyone. Like Jen suggested, my name is Leanne Nicolo. I'm an incident response lead here, working on the Coalition incident response team. So I help run a team that offers IR and forensic services to our insureds when they're facing a cyber incident, such as ransomware and business email compromises. This is my 8th year working in cybersecurity, but I would say in the past 4 or 5 years, I've really shifted my focus to ransomware specific. So handle a lot of ransomware negotiations, remediation efforts, and alongside what Jared and his team does, prevention efforts, which we'll definitely get into here.
Great, thank you both. Before we kick off, I want to just point your attention to the bottom of your screen. You should see 2 buttons, a chat icon, a Q&A button, and we would encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation through either one of those. I'm going to be moderating the questions throughout, so if you have something timely on one of the slides that they're presenting, we'll moderate it then, and we'll also have some time reserved at the end for dedicated Q&A. So definitely encourage you to send in your questions. So we're going to be covering a few different topics today. First, going through ransomware 101. What is ransomware? When we talk about ransomware, malware variants, ransom payments, what are we actually talking about? And just kind of set the stage for what we're seeing in these attacks. Then we're going to go a deep dive into the incident timeline. So everything from initial infection all the way through to what the remediation and recovery process looks like. Then Jared's going to walk us through the SentinelOne solution and platform and how really their technology works to help prevent and detect ransomware from actually occurring. And then finally, at the end, we'll have some Q&A. All right, so excited to turn it over to Leanne to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Jen. So here's a few basics just to talk about ransomware a bit more broadly. So when we say ransomware, what do we mean? The word in the industry is pretty self-explanatory, but people who are not dealing with a ransomware infection, it's important that you understand it's at a very high level an infection that involves some or all of the files on a computer becoming inaccessible. When we say inaccessible, we used to refer to encrypted. So the attackers would encrypt the data and then hold the data for ransom. So hold it hostage until you pay some amount to them. As we move forward in this industry, we see the attackers doing one of two additional things: deleting data and or stealing data with the threat of exfiltrating and posting it, releasing it into the wild. So it's definitely changed a bit where it's not just encrypting, but it's basically holding your data hostage in some way until they're paid. The threat actors in these cases leave behind a way to contact them. So in order to get your data back, whether that's to purchase a decryptor or prevent the release of your data on the dark web, they leave behind what we refer to as a ransom note. So these are HTML or text files in providing a way to contact them, whether that's through email by providing an email address or giving a Tor website for you to visit on the dark web to chat with them, basically a way to make contact, to start negotiations and kind of talk through what occurred. The visual appearances of these attacks vary. So sometimes it's every single computer on a network is impacted. Sometimes it's just a handful of servers. Sometimes it's all the files. Sometimes it's just a select few. Sometimes it's full disk encryption. You can't even log into the computer without contacting them. So they're very different in nature. Without a solid backup solution, many of the victims in a ransomware attack have to entertain the possibility of paying in order to get their data back. Not only here at Coalition, but pretty much industry-wide, we talk about backups. It's extremely important to back up and have a good copy of your data so that you're not left in the kind of dark and you have no choice but to pay to decrypt. As people have gotten better over the years with backing up their data access and extortion has definitely been on the rise. So how I mentioned previously, data is now being stolen for the release of publication. So it is very important not only to have good backups, but to also understand where your sensitive data is and maybe make sure that it's not easily accessible if somebody were to get on the network. And the preferred currency for these threat actors in terms of receiving payment has been Bitcoin. It's always in some form of cryptocurrency. We have paid, I believe, Monero and Dash for 2 additional types, but Bitcoin is definitely still king in this arena. So here's a rough kind of incident timeline. It starts with a security concern. So a policyholder of Coalition suspects that something's going on, or they receive an alert from our scanning team that we're seeing some activity external coming from their network. So they set up a call with, first, it's the claims team to have a chat about whether or not it's a claim. The claims team immediately brings in a forensic vendor, which is what me and my team act as. If we're unable to take the case for whatever reason, we have a panel of vendors that we work with, but a forensic specialty firm will come in to assess kind of what's going on and assist. At the same time, counsel will most likely be involved. So breach coaches are brought on just to have a discussion on, is sensitive data accessed? What kind of data do you store? Are we dealing with PHI, PCI data? And then an investigation is kicked off. So after the initial contact, we move towards the assessment if forensics is necessary. So, the most surefire way to know an investigation needs to be done is if somebody calls us and says, okay, all of our data is encrypted. All of our files are locked. We can't access our files. What is this? What do we do? That's where we really shine, kind of coming in from the absolute beginning and walking somebody through ransomware from day one. There's a lot of indicators that we look for, not only in our assessment, but throughout the forensic investigation. Some of them listed here. So we're looking for illegitimate logins to any email accounts, therefore confirming a business email compromise, which may have led to like a funds transfer fraud case, illegitimate remote access. So oftentimes these bad actors get into a network by way of RDP or another third-party remote tool. Another big thing is phishing email. So a malicious attachment will be sent via a phishing email. Another good indicator that something's going on is that antivirus and backups are becoming disabled on endpoints, not legitimately. So a lot of attackers do this kind of during the recon phase to be able to deploy a ransomware payload without, any alert. Another thing is changes. So password changes taking place on the network, new accounts being created, and then malicious emails not only being received, but also being sent from accounts. So the third step in kind of our timeline is a forensic investigation. So me and my team or a third party vendor completes kind of our forensic work, remediation. So we want to make sure that the bad actor is off the network, the data is clean, whether that looks like active monitoring with an EDR tool such as SentinelOne, which is highly recommended, or it's a more of like a rip and rebuild. So new systems, a clean network. In those cases, we still suggest EDR kind of thrown in the environment, but we'll get into that in a bit. And then recovery. So the claims team talks through all of the expenses and we get the policyholder back up and running.
Leanne, a couple of questions came in on this. And first off, can you address where in this process the actual negotiation with the threat actor happens and what that process is like? I know you've been involved directly in a number of those. And so I'm curious if you could just sort of share some frontline experience from when that happens and what some of the experiences you've had in the negotiation process have been.
Sure. So it's hard to put an exact time frame on it. Obviously, it's different. It's unique in every case. We know that we have to make contact with the threat actor if one of two things are present. The client has business critical data that they do not have backups for, so they cannot continue their business without purchasing a decryptor to get that data back, or they have what we call the crown jewels. So basically very important proprietary or healthcare data, something that could potentially close the business doors by way of a very expensive notification, or if any proprietary data got leaked into the world, we have to begin negotiations to see if the attacker can, one, present the data that was stolen to help us put a price on it, and B, begin that negotiation to see if we can pay them to delete the data and or provide us the decryptor. So usually on our first assessment call, we'll have that conversation of, do you have backups? What type of data do you store? Where is it on the network? Is there a concern that it was accessed? Is it encrypted? Are we dealing with PHI? Counsel will talk through the sensitive data types and our concern there. There's a lot of detail, a lot of legal detail that goes into that. Where the employees or the infected individuals live state-wise, which type of laws we have to follow, the time frame of those laws. So when notification duties kick off, so to say. So we usually have a good idea whether we need to make contact pretty early on during an assessment. But I would say within the first week or so, that contact is made, whether it's to buy time, discuss data deletion, or discuss decryption.
Great, thank you. Another thing came in too, just about how, you mentioned different ways in which an organization would know that they've been affected by ransomware. So obviously the most extreme case, as you noted, is all of your systems or your data are completely locked down and you're not able to log in and access that business critical data or system. Mm-hmm. But a question came in about, would we ever send an alert to a policyholder? Would we be able to notify them of some sort of security issue before that happens? Like, would we be able to detect that there's ransomware or malware in the network before actually getting to the full-on, lockdown of their systems?
Mm-hmm. So ransomware, potentially, but usually once ransomware starts running, it's pretty loud and the client usually it's something that's very hard to miss. Obviously, your files are all becoming locked. But the precursor to ransomware, yes, absolutely. So we refer to them in-house as like signal data, but this is like banking Trojan and other various pieces of malware that are used in conjunction with a ransomware payload. We monitor a lot of known attacker kind of patterns and networks. And so if we see any of those signals coming from an insured's network, or we have reason to believe that they're vulnerable to any type of attack based on the hardware or software we know they're using, we do send out proactive alerts. So we try to work with them, and obviously there's different priorities on different alerts that we send, but the ones that could lead to a ransomware infection, yeah, we're pretty clear about them.
Great. And a final question on this is about backups, and whether ransomware can access and encrypt cloud backups that are segregated from the network, whether you've seen that in any of the cases that you've worked, or if that would be secure and safe from experiencing a ransomware event.
So I don't want to blanket say that it would be safe, because we have seen it, but it is quite rare. Usually, so the way that ransomware works, it's a payload or an executable on an endpoint that then runs and encrypts specific file types that it has access to. So if data is in the cloud, but it's currently syncing with data on premise, so if there's a local file that is then syncing to Dropbox Cloud, for example, if the local file gets encrypted and the sync process completes and the encrypted file replaces the file on the cloud, we will see presence of encrypted files on the cloud. The process of restoring on the cloud is much different. A lot of the tools have really good recovery in terms of moving to a previous version. We also see a lot of these third-party tools have separate logins to their cloud platform, such as Dropbox, just for an example, but I know there's hundreds, which definitely we like to caveat any login to any access to any data anywhere, throw multi-factor authentication on. So if the attacker does have the password to your account on your network, but they go to access a cloud platform where that data is stored and they get prompted with MFA, that's usually enough to divert them, rather just trying to get the data on the local network encrypted rather than moving all around and picking through. They also, unless there's a local sync kind of connection going on the endpoint, may not even know the data lives up there. So it is pretty rare. In most cases, we do not see it traveling to the cloud, but it is possible.
Great, thank you. I think Jared now is going to talk specifically about the Sentinel One platform and some of the capabilities within the EDR platform.
Yeah, thanks. So happy to talk about this. So Sentinel One, we definitely have EDR capabilities. We do a little bit more than just that. What I would describe for people maybe not familiar with this space is, we started off with AVs back in the day. It was like this signature that you had to download onto your machine, and then it would scan all your files, which like slowed your machine down. It would look for bad stuff. Attackers figured that out pretty quickly. So they started using scripts and techniques we call live attacks. So they'll come in through a remote shell connection, and then they'll be able to type on their end, and the commands execute directly live on your machine. So there's no files to scan. And in the security industry, what we did is we built these sensors that we called EDRs back in the day. And those sensors were like flight data recorders. They would just record everything. And so when the attack was going on, well, the sensors record everything off into a database, and they sort of processed it in a database, and they could generate an alert saying, hey, here's what I just saw happen. So the security team, maybe within 5, 10, 30 minutes, up to an hour of relevancy, would get an alert. As long as the team can follow up on all the alerts, you could catch stuff and stop the attack in the middle of it. What Sentinel One did is we took that AV prevention and we took that EDR and kind of mashed it all together. And this is an endpoint protection space now. And we stuck in the middle of it this behavior model. And what we said with that behavior model is, I want to be able to catch these people who are doing their live typing on a keyboard, and those commands are transmitting across, and they're attacking live. I want to shut them down based on their behavior. I don't want to have to send an alert to a security team and make someone, react and triage, and maybe a couple hours later, I want to stop them the moment they're doing something bad. So we we created this detection and response engine that you kind of see there. That's a live engine. It sits on the machine and it stops bad stuff in the middle of when it happens. That same cool technology that powers that behavioral detection and response engine also is a flight data recorder, and we use that engine to do a recovery and a response. So what I mean by recovery or response is I can literally click a button in the console and the computer will go back to a pre-attack state. So one of the most popular product demos that we do is we actually take ransomware, we turn off all the protection capabilities in SentinelOne, and we let ransomware encrypt the box. Then we go in the console, we click the undo button, we call it rollback, and that machine goes back to its pre-attack state, including all the encrypted files are restored. So SentinelOne has some great capabilities there, but we also give you all of the network visibility. We give you the ability for firewall controls, and with IoT devices, you can actually put controls to mitigate your attack surface. So if you can even keep them from getting in, that's even better. And we also are an XDR solution. So we have all these integrations and all this data we can ingest from other security products where we can put our behavioral and AI analysis across an entire data plane to really help you get ahead of even being attacked. And that's really what our goal is. We work across all the different operating systems. We work in cloud environments, as you can see here. So where businesses are doing business, that's where you can find SentinelOne. If we can jump up to the next slide. This is a bit more of a breakdown of what I was describing in terms of how the agent technology works. But SentinelOne's technology that you're going to install on your computer. And what we have is multiple layers here. So instead of having a traditional AV that's like slows your machine down or needs these signature updates, we use an AI model. We can completely replace AV. So you can get rid of your AV and just install SentinelOne. And we will probably do a better job of that.
I'm just going to interrupt you really quickly and just say for those listening, AV antivirus in case.
Sorry, good point. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, antivirus, right? So we can get rid of your old antivirus and we can actually give you something that's going to use less resources and stop slowing down your machine and do better protection there. And then you get this behavioral analysis engine that's going to essentially be like a virtual security guard, like living inside of your computer. And when something behaves badly, we stop and we convict it on behavior. So that's really, really cool stuff. You also get the ability then to automate with SentinelOne. And the automation is key because now what we're doing is we are detecting and responding to the attack at the speed of compute, not at the speed of people. And with the automated remediations, you can have, people are traveling, people are at home, people are in different places. These policies, these restoration policies will just automatically happen. It's one of the industry marketing terms that I really don't like, but it's true, is the self-healing endpoint. That's kind of what we're providing there. But for the advanced teams, for the security teams that want to go in and do threat intelligence applications and deep dive threat hunting and live response activities, we have a full deep visibility and response capability in the product. So folks like Leanne can get on and they can go in and do a deep investigation. And it's all done with a single agent. And that single agent typically is going to take off an antivirus agent, a legacy EDR agent, and just put one agent in. And the nice part of this is because we're doing it all in one agent, we have better visibility, we have better context. We're giving you performance back, but we're also giving you less noise. And this is the thing that probably most people get surprised about. We have fewer false positives, fewer responses you need to respond to because we have more context about where things are coming from. So the very notion of why people get a little nervous about taking and accepting AI and automation, I don't want something making accidents and whatnot. Look, we've got 30% of the Fortune 10 running SentinelOne. We have, a very, very large customer base out there. Chances are we've seen what's on your machines before, but we also have best practice guides. We have great deployment guides. So it's very easy to adopt. You'll find it's probably less intrusive, less noisy, less cumbersome. It's holistically, it's a much better solution. I equate it to this. When I was in college, I drove a 1978. It was a Datsun 280Z. Like it had crank up windows. It had an air conditioner, but the brakes were power. The brakes had no power, right? So no power steering, no power brakes. The car I have today, it's got like automated everything. I was driving both vehicles, but I guarantee you, I want to drive the car I'm driving today because it's a much more pleasant experience. So, next slide, please.
Quick questions, a couple questions before we move on from that.
Oh,
So
awesome.
one person asked, and this is, I think, related to what you were describing before with the rollback capabilities. One person said, they are dealing with a system that manages a huge amount of traffic and it would be uncertain whether they could actually roll back to something in an earlier state because of just the magnitude of data. So how does that work with your rollback system?
Yeah, there's going to be some systems probably that we can't do that on if it's a massive data. Most servers, most cases that I've seen, actually every case I've seen, it's been very acceptable for how we do it. You can control the configurations and limitations of what resources you want to allow us to have. We typically recommend allocating 2 gigabit of hard drive space for SentinelOne to work with, but we've seen people that can give more. If you're in a really high-end production server environment and you can't give those resources or something of that nature, we'll just focus on making sure we have the maximum protection capabilities on that machine so you don't have to have the need to do a recovery scenario.
Great. Another question came in specific to the point you addressed earlier about false positives. And are there any sort of negatives that result from, or any sort of system-wide impacts from a false positive detection?
Yeah, look, I think in this career field in general, and I was in the Air Force, I was a buyer for 10 years, right? Every vendor walked the door promising me to give me new detections and new alerts. And by the end of it, I was telling me, I don't want any more alerts. Like, I'm drowning in alerts. Give me fewer. So that's really one of the areas we focused a lot of intellectual property on is let's be precise, let's be accurate, let's say what's needed when it's needed, and let's not go above and beyond. There's definitely cases where companies have proprietary software, employees that have really interesting roles that have to do certain things, but we have mechanisms to cope and adapt for that. And it's very simple to adjust the software to manage for those. So if there is a need or a false positive scenario, we can adjust for it very quickly. Generally, organizations, when they deploy SentinelOne, they're deploying into an alert-only mode for the first several weeks. So any scenario where we have a false positive that would need to be worked around, those are identified really quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Managing alert fatigue is definitely critical. And yet we've all seen so many companies that have experienced the worst by not paying attention to an alert. And so it's how do you strike that right balance of surfacing the right things, as you pointed out. Last question here, and then we'll move on to the next one, is about the types of systems and apps that SentinelOne plugs into. Everything from email to cloud storage to custom build applications. Where does SentinelOne integrate?
Oh yeah, well, we have Sentinel storage for the storage applications. We have mobile solutions, all the computers you're operating, clouds, Kubernetes, K8s. It's, where do you need to compute at? It's probably where you're going to find SentinelOne at. We also have a very large ecosystem of partnerships as well. So you look at things like multi-factor authentication. I'm a huge fan of multi-factor authentication. So I probably want to have all of my data from Okta coming into my SentinelOne and my XDR system, right? And this is where we go beyond just traditional EDR, is I can bring these other data sets in and I can help them be part of my security story. Let me bring in threat intelligence. Let me bring in information from my user login space. So those are all things where SentinelOne's able to help and assist.
Great, thank you. And we're actually just going to open it up to general Q&A. We've gotten a lot of questions in, so thanks for everyone for submitting those, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So first question, kind of going back to the incident timeline discussion that we had at the beginning with Leanne, which is, what should someone do if they think they're under attack? Who should you contact first? Should you be shutting any systems down? Like, what tactically should someone do in that sort of first response stage?
I'll take this one for sure. So I mean, the easiest question for me to say is an incident response team, like an expert to come in. Unfortunately, we go right back around to the insurance to then bring everybody lined up, because we need breach counsel usually, and we need to know if it's covered under a claim, and they have coverage questions, which obviously my team cannot speak to. So I would say the second something is going on in the network, even if it's a question and it's a pre-claim and you just want to chat with us, contact your insurance provider. So contact insurance immediately. They'll bring in the forensic experts, whether it's my team or it's a third-party vendor, as well as counsel, who will be able to give you an opinion on kind of which direction and next steps.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, what I would say, like, I want to reinforce a point that she made. The ransomware event is not the first thing that happens. There's a lot of precursor activity, and oftentimes that precursor activity is noticed, but it's noticed with a bit of doubt. And if a professional team is brought in early enough, like the pre-claim activity just mentioned, that could save a tremendous amount of pain. There's generally, from what I've seen in the last 2 years, there's generally a 21 to 38 day window where you really have a shot to get ahead of the event.
And
So
what is the actor doing in your system that entire time?
So that's the fun stuff. That's where forensics comes in. Just to add on what Jared said, we had a client, and actually a SentinelOne client, Jared, that just purchased SentinelOne, and they were just starting to deploy it. I think it was on 2 systems out of 300. And they noticed the execution of a credential harvesting tool called Mimikatz, which, is pretty known bad actor activity, but unless you know that, it would just be odd. You'd have to just Google and you'd find that out pretty quickly. But they called us and they said, we see Mimikatz on the network, and within minutes, we see the ransomware executable, trying to deploy and attempting to disable all these tools, and the attackers in there live. And if they didn't let us know that that was going on, or they dismissed that alert, it probably would have turned into a full-fledged, fully encrypted network, because, things were not in place yet, although they were moving there. And there's a question, Jen, in here, which kind of ties right into this from Brett. So I could just answer it live if you'd like, but it says, what backup timing is best? So in your experience, how far does the ransomware sit dormant? That's a very hard question to answer. The longest that we've ever seen in my experience, I think, was 14 months. So a little over a year, we saw confirmed access on a network, and then the ransomware was either deployed by that group or the access was resold. We also see cases where clients call us that something's going on or there's some activity, and we see the first connection from the attacker happening the night before. So I would say that that's pretty accurate, Jared, what you said. Probably 3 weeks is probably average. 2 to 3 weeks, we see them in there. We've referenced that they're doing what we call reconnaissance. They're basically seeing what type of data you have. If they're dealing with PHI, a high volume of data, can they resell this? What is this worth? Payroll data, they're just looking for stuff to hang over your head or resell. And then they're also attempting to break down the doors in between the different systems to get the ransomware to impact as many endpoints as possible. So they're really spending time just learning the network, learning the type of data, and making sure that the infection goes as far and wide as it can.
I had a related question that came in about, if the data has been exfiltrated, what are companies' options at that point? I mean, does it mean that they just have to pay, and that's really the only way to prevent the exposure of that data? Or are there other ways that companies can react in that scenario?
So that's another pretty case-specific question. It really comes down to what is the data that we believed they took. So number one, what are the attackers producing? So what are they showing us that they stole? And what does that kind of price have, and what contains in that data, which is a big legal question. The second is, during the forensic investigation, what can we confirm what was accessed and exfiltrated? So do we see log data that shows us actual file names or email inboxes or whatever the detail may be of the data that we're pretty certain the attacker at least looked at? it's really hard to answer that question. What are the options? Because the options are, if the attacker wants to resell it, if it's in their possession, they will. And the only really best way forward, if we need to discuss negotiation and payment, is to actually pay them some payment for them to delete the data. We are dealing with cyber criminals, so we definitely take it with a grain of salt. They do believe that they are businessmen, so they provide us like a data deletion record in these cases. So again, take it for what that's worth. But I would say it's pretty much a best effort. So what type of data can we confirm was taken? What does this look like for your business? Do you have to notify? Is this your crown jewels in terms of proprietary data that you cannot afford to be released? That question is obviously a bit more difficult to have, because then we're kind of stuck. But I would say the biggest thing there then where EDR kind of comes in is prevent, prevent, prevent. Let's not get to the point where data is exfiltrated, because it is a very difficult conversation to have.
So on the point of prevention, and Jared, maybe you can answer this question. Question came in about the increase in attacks that we're seeing through vendors and third parties. And obviously there's this big wave of attacks that we've seen, often referred to as supply chain attacks, where a piece of software or a third party that a company relies on to conduct some part of their business experiences a ransomware attack. And then that has sort of this ripple effect across all the organizations that use that vendor or that supplier. And so how should companies prepare for that type of attack, and where do SentinelOne solutions kind of fit into the prevention in that scenario?
No, that's a fantastic question. That's a great challenge, right? And I've worked in this space for 20 years now. For the last 15 years, that was really nation state only that you worried about that, and the targets were really selective. SolarWinds kind of popped it open, right? SolarWinds was the first big one where we saw the Russian government come in, very, very stealthy attack. They embedded themselves into IT management software. That stuff gets installed everywhere. In that particular case, and every vendor is going to have a different story to answer these supply chain ones, by the way. But in that particular case, if SentinelOne was installed on a machine, the attack wouldn't run. The SolarWinds attack simply would not happen. So we had zero machines from customers impacted from that. I think, though, the greater question is methodically, or from a methodology, what can I do to safeguard against supply chain type of attacks? There's no simple answer to this. What I will, though, kind of open up with is anybody who's leveraging or relying on open source software or relying on tools built using open source software is relying on tools which have open access to supply chain compromise. So in the airline and the nuclear space, you do independent verification and validation of source code. That's the workaround. Companies can't do that on their own. You can't do an independent software analysis of every product you buy. SentinelOne, for example, though, we have independently implemented our own IV&V program, so our own independent verification and validation program. We take the code that our engineers write, it goes to a different business unit who then inspects it and validates it and looks for supply chain compromise. And we can tell our customers that we have this process in place as a methodology to safeguard against supply chain. That's what we feel is required as a security vendor. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any other vendor that does that.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to that is, as Jared said, it just becomes this complicated network of your own software providers, your own partners that you really have to have a good handle on how secure are they. One of the things that we offer at Coalition through our control platform is an attack surface monitoring product that gives you kind of an outside-in view of the vendors and software providers that you use, an outside-in view of their risk. And that can be a great way to sort of see from an external perspective, the way that a hacker would view that organization, what vulnerabilities are present or may make them a target. Now, that's only an outside-in view. So what Jared's talking about is a deep assessment sort of across all layers of their security. And that goes beyond this component that we're talking about through control. But this is a good way, at least as a starting point, to say, how from an outside-in perspective is a bad actor going to be looking at the software providers that I use? And does that put me at any risk, any incremental risk because of any vulnerabilities or insecurities that they have?
See, I find that like a really valuable addition that you're providing people there, because look, before you hire employees, you do background checks. Before you do business with a third party, how do you do a cyber background check? And it sounds like a great benefit for clients.
Yeah, I like that phrase, cyber background check. That's I'm going to steal that one.
Jen, I have something to add quickly. So Jared, in the chat, somebody is requesting contact info to get started with SentinelOne. If you want to pop, if you guys have kind of a general email or line there. But with that, I want to make it very clear that, we've had insureds ask us, is it good enough to just put EDR on a system and walk away? Jared, I'm definitely interested in your thoughts here. I think it's better than nothing, right? The tool running is better than nothing. But I think we definitely need to make it clear that you have to have somebody who understands technology and monitoring and help you with exclusions and help you looking at the alerts. My team utilizes SentinelOne during our investigations. So we actively monitor, and if there's a forensic investigation, we will do that on your behalf for whatever the time frame is that we are providing our service. But you do need somebody who can go in and kind of say, okay, this is bad. We need to now make this a higher priority rather than set it and forget it kind of thing.
I would completely agree with that. Look, if you want to just set it and forget it, then, and this is my completely biased, I work for SentinelOne opinion, but with our focus on automation and the manner in which we use automation, it's a great tool to do that with. I'm not saying that's the end all solution. I'm saying that's like the min protection you should have. Unfortunately, that's what I do for my family, right? I just install this stuff, I set it and forget it because I never have time to check on it. But to your point, most organizations are struggling to find the ability, the time, the competencies, the expertise to go out and build a professional security team. That's really difficult stuff to do. We have a program at SentinelOne called Vigilance, which is an MDR, a managed detection and response team. We've gone out and built the professional security team for you. That team has security operations centers in multiple parts of the globe. So we have eyes on glass, if you want to use that term, 24/7. Every holiday is covered, every hour is covered, and there's always somebody responding to that. When you can have a team like that augmented with something like what the coalition offering is providing, you have a stellar solution. So I would say that, can you go to a vendor and do a set it and forget it? Sure, you can. With SentinelOne, you could go with SentinelOne plus Vigilance, put it in a set it and forget it mode. We'll do everything we can on the back end. We'll watch with that team, and that's protection modules. If you want to expand that and you want to go across products and you want to just really kind of outsource, like absolutely what you just heard Ann talking about is the great way to go about it. I just don't see very many organizations now, even in larger organizations, wanting to build out these massive monitoring teams. They want to take their security expertise and be very focused and on point with it. That first layer of tier 1 monitoring is not really a job a lot of people want to do anymore.
Yeah, and just to add one more thing to that too, I think one of the things we talk about a lot with policyholders and sort of thinking about, best practices in terms of having good security hygiene. There's always going to be new software and tools on the market. There are a handful of things that every company should do to dramatically lower the likelihood that they will be targeted. And I would say, implementing an EDR solution, implementing MFA, having good backups, having password managers, doing employee training to help your employees understand what to be looking for in terms of phishing emails. You implement some of those basics and you're going to be able to prevent the vast majority of attacks.
I would actually prioritize them in the order you listed them too. But yeah, you do those, you're going to be pretty darn close to safe.
Yeah, and I think it always just becomes a question of prioritize those things and equip your team with the tools they need to focus on those things. And for better or worse, you just don't want to be the least secure person on the block, and you can avoid the vast majority of cyber claims and threats.
So Jen, that brings me to your next point that I literally repeat in every single presentation I've ever done. But It's just how much protection you put in place. And I always just explain, if you have a house and you have a front door and it's unlocked, an attacker can just walk in. If the door is locked, they're going to have to work a little harder to get in. If you have 2 doors, 3 doors, 5 doors, and they're all locked, they're probably just going to go to the neighbors. The majority of these attacks are opportunistic, and the same as with cyber, that if the opportunity presents itself, they're going to take it. Of course, there's targeted attacks, and that becomes a little bit trickier. But with the opportunistic attacks, just don't be the most insecure one. Protection, prevention, as many things you have in place, the harder it is to get. There's tons of businesses out there, and as sad as that sounds, the attackers will just move on.
Well, I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap up, because I know we're a little over time, but I want to thank everyone, first of all, for all the great questions. I think this is obviously an important and rapidly evolving topic, and so appreciate your diligence and an interest in helping protect your organization. Also, a big thank you to Leanne and Jared for spending time with us and sharing your expertise from your worlds. And so thank you both for making the time. And as a last point, we're going to be sending out after this presentation a follow-up email with the recording so you can share it with team members or others at your organization. And we'd encourage you, if you're interested in learning more about how to offer coalition insurance if you're a broker, or if you are an organization and interested in accessing these tools, and particularly accessing SentinelOne, you can sign up through control.coalitioninc.com, and we'll send out all this information in email so that you have it handy. Thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.